So welcome everyone to our third episode of Talkplomacy about the Ukrainian situation. Today with us we have Kevin John Heller, who is a professor of international law and security at the University of Copenhagen Center of Military Studies and professor of law at the Australian National University. He's also currently serves as special advisor to the International Criminal Court prosecutor on international criminal law discourse. So maybe if you want, you can complete this quick introduction, maybe by telling us more about like your research areas or more about your background, if you feel so.
I mean, I think you covered a lot of it. I've been an academic for 17 years. I was a criminal defense attorney before that. I've been very active in kind of the practice of international criminal law and international humanitarian law over the years, kind of most notoriously defending Radovan Karadzic at the ICTY. Now, as you said, I serve as a special advisor to the prosecutor. And just to make clear, all my comments today are purely in my personal capacity and not on behalf of the Office of the Prosecutor. I've known Karim for a long time. I worked with him at UNITAD in Iraq, putting together training programs for Iraqi judges dealing with Daesh prosecutions. I serve as an expert to one of the defense teams involved in the 9/11 trial at Guantanamo Bay, Ramzi bin al-Shibh. So, I've kind of seen all of the various sides of international criminal law, and this is what I guess what I do for a living.
This is perfect. That's why you are here. So we invited you to take on let's say, the legal perspective of what is happening currently in Ukraine. So as we all know, it's been 7 months that with the excuse of genocide committed against the Donetsk and Luhansk population, the Russian government decided to enter in Ukraine under the argument of a special military operation that actually was not limited to those two regions, but to the whole country, which currently trigger an important humanitarian crisis and a war in this country. So maybe to start like simple, what would be the 3 words you will use to describe this war and why?
Sorry, repeat the question.
What would be the 3 words you will use to describe this war and why? Like if you had to choose like 3 words.
How about crime of aggression?
If you want to, like, feel free. Like if I tell you Ukrainian war, what will you say right now?
Those would be my 3 words. I mean that, we've always seen aggression as, one of, if not the most serious international crime, precisely because the criminality doesn't usually stop with the act of aggression. When one country invades another country, they don't tend to treat the inhabitants humanely. They don't tend to fight in a clean way. As they said at Nuremberg, aggression contains within itself all of the other international crimes. So one of the reasons why we've taken it so seriously, or tried to take it seriously over the past 75 years since Nuremberg, is precisely not just because the crime of aggression is so bad, but because of all of the bad things that it will lead to following the invasion. And I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine illustrates that point pretty well.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So on the 7th of August, the Reuters press agency reported almost 26,000 suspected war crimes cases in Ukraine since the beginning of the conflict. So to go back to like the basics, so what is a war crime and who is investigating those crimes? If you could give a quick definition.
Yeah, I mean, if you want, we tend to use the concept of war crimes fairly liberally and fairly loosely. If we want the precise legal definition, a war crime is a violation of the laws of war, a violation of international humanitarian law that also carries with it individual criminal responsibility. So obviously the laws of war are very vast. You can look at the 4 Geneva Conventions, the first and second protocols additional to the Geneva Conventions, hundreds and hundreds of rules, particularly rules that apply in an international armed conflict, a conflict between 2 states like we have in Ukraine and Russia. But not all of those rules of IHL are necessarily war crimes. You can violate IHL and a state can become responsible for its actions without any individual in that state necessarily having committed a war crime. A war crime is a much smaller subset of the rules of IHL that you can prosecute someone for. So one of the challenges, although it's a little easier because the Rome Statute has an exclusive list of things that it considers war crimes, but one of the challenges is usually figuring out, did this particular violation violate a rule that is a war crime, or is it just the kind of garden variety violation that would give rise to state responsibility? So
Okay. And would you
that's
say that this crime of aggression you were talking about is one of the war crimes committed by Russia?
No, so I mean, it's a completely different it's an independent international crime. We have, generally speak of, 4 types of international crimes. We have crime of aggression, genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And so those are independent, although of course in an actual conflict, they tend all to be committed. So we need to distinguish them in terms of responsibility. It also matters in terms of who's investigating. Because as you asked who's investigating war crimes, well, I think the answer is probably who isn't investigating war crimes right now. Obviously, the Ukrainian Attorney General's office is deeply involved in investigating war crimes. There's an ongoing investigation by the International Criminal Court in Ukraine that is looking at war crimes. There are probably dozens of Ukrainian and international NGOs that are in Ukraine investigating war crimes. Now, obviously, there's a difference between an NGO investigating war crimes and a court, whether domestic or international, investigating war crimes, because they can actually prosecute them. But there's a lot of activity from civil society trying to document and develop evidence of war crimes that could then be of use to an ICC prosecution or a domestic Ukrainian prosecution. So it's a very active world. Aggression is much smaller. The Ukraine Attorney General says that they're investigating aggression, and aggression is a crime under Ukrainian criminal law. The ICC is not investigating aggression because they don't have jurisdiction over Russia's invasion. So there is what they call, an impunity gap or an accountability gap that makes it harder to prosecute aggression than war crimes, just because there isn't as many venues that have the ability to do it.
Yeah, maybe just to say it, like neither Russia or Ukraine are part of the Rome Statute. So is it why the International Criminal Court can't really investigate?
So I mean, in theory, the ICC has jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. And that became active about 5 years ago after a very long, and I won't bore you with the long story, a process of getting it into the Rome Statute defined in such a way that the court could investigate it. But that doesn't mean that they have jurisdiction over every individual act of aggression committed anywhere in the world. The problem is there's a very, very narrow jurisdictional regime that governs aggression. Basically, unless both the aggressor and the victim state have joined the ICC and have ratified the aggression amendments and have not opted out of the court's jurisdiction over aggression, there is no jurisdiction. And so this is an easy one here. A non-state party can never be prosecuted for aggression at the ICC. And Russia is not a state party to the Rome Statute. They haven't ratified the Rome Statute. They're not a member of the court. So although that doesn't mean that the ICC can't investigate other crimes that Russia has committed on the territory of Ukraine, it does mean that the court can't investigate aggression.
Okay. So this leads to my next question, because recently you wrote an article about options for prosecuting Russia aggressions. So maybe, I don't know if you can do for us like a summary of the 3 options you are investigating, because I know it's long, but maybe do a quick summary of the 3 and their limits, of course, because I know you addressed also their limits within your articles, and maybe I know which one, but for you, which one is the best options between those 3?
Okay, I can try. Very broad question. I mean, basically, there are, more or less 2 different routes. One is focusing on some kind of international or internationalized court. to handle aggression, or a purely domestic court, whether Ukraine or another country that has jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. There's a whole bunch of options within those two basic categories. I think the most talked about solution or option or mechanism or whatever language you prefer is, what they call the special tribunal for the prosecution of aggression against Ukraine. And basically that would be what we call an ad hoc tribunal, kind of like the Yugoslav tribunal or the Rwanda tribunal, that would be created just to deal with Russian aggression against Ukraine. No other crimes that Russia has committed against Ukraine, no other acts of aggression committed by anybody other than Ukraine, just other than Russia, just that one particular situation. Now, even there are different ways to go about creating the tribunal. Probably the most talked about one would simply be a bunch of states getting together and negotiating a treaty with Ukraine. Ukraine has to be included. Negotiating a treaty with Ukraine to create this tribunal. And then assumingly the powerful states would fund it and they would pay the salaries of prosecutors and investigators, etc. That's one model, and I think that's the most talked about one. Another way to do it would be something more like the Cambodia Tribunal or the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which would be created by negotiating an agreement between Ukraine and the UN. And then having states that believe in this tribunal, funding it, staffing it, etc. Those are different ways to go about it. They have different legal implications. We could talk about some of them, but that's still basically one idea for an ad hoc tribunal. There's another approach, which is the one that I favor, which is what we would more call a hybrid tribunal or an internationalized tribunal, which is it would still be a Ukrainian court. It would be located in Ukraine's judicial system, but it would not be a traditional domestic criminal court. It would be an internationalized court in the sense that it would be probably funded and staffed and trained by the international community. It wouldn't apply necessarily just Ukrainians' domestic law of aggression. It would probably apply the international definition of aggression, and there are some differences. It's kind of a halfway house between a purely domestic prosecution and a full-fledged, Yugoslav or Rwanda-like tribunal. That's the one that I favor, and that would be, supported by, I think, the Council of Europe, but it could be supported by the EU. It could be supported by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. There are different ways to do it. Then the third model is the purely domestic one. And as I said, Ukraine has said that they're investigating domestically a number of suspects for aggression. There are other states like Lithuania and Poland that also have the crime of aggression in their domestic penal codes and have universal jurisdiction over aggression. So they have said that they're going to investigate Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And that's another option for doing it. Again, all of them have their pros and cons, and we can talk about the pros and cons if you want, but those are at least kind of the basic models.
Okay, perfect. And to talk about like the International Court of Justice, so I think Ukraine sued Russia for it because they are both part of it.
Yep.
What would be the possible sanctions, like if in the case that the ECJ ruled in favor of Ukraine in this case, like what are the sanctions you can take? It can take.
Well, I mean, any of the form of reparations that the court statute allows. I mean, it could be demanding that Russia leave. That would be a fairly obvious one. Apologize, pay reparations to Ukraine for the damage that they've caused, promise to never do it again. But the biggest difference, of course, is that the ICJ is not a criminal court. And so no one could be held individually criminally responsible for any crime or any violation of international law at the ICJ. That operates purely at the level of the Ukrainian government and the Russian government. Yeah. So it really stands alongside of criminal responsibility. It doesn't in any way replace it or substitute for it.
Okay, so stop me if I'm wrong, but the ICJ is more like a court for like states, and the ICC or ad hoc tribunal is more like a court for individuals in front of like the Yeah.
That's
So
yeah.
under the options of hybrid courts you were mentioning, I know like in Rwanda or ex-Yugoslavia, like court, responsible leaders have been like judged. But do you think it will be, for instance, possible to like judge Putin or his foreign minister?
Okay, well, there's a whole bunch of questions wrapped up in that question. So one is probably the broadest question that applies to literally any court that tries to prosecute anyone for anything in this conflict, and that is, can they actually get their hands on the defendant? And if they can get their hands on the defendant, can they get the evidence? There have been, lower level Russian soldiers that have fallen into the hands of Ukraine, and they have prosecuted some Russian soldiers for war crimes. That's possible. That will probably happen. But when we're starting to talk about the most senior leaders in Russia, the people who are probably most responsible for the international crimes committed in the Ukraine, whether they will ever fall into the hands of anybody who can prosecute them is another story. Putin is probably not going to be taking a vacation on the French Riviera or, in Tuscany anytime soon. I can't imagine any of the senior leadership of Russia is going to be leaving Russia to go anywhere other than a really friendly country like, China or, or North Korea anytime soon, places that they know are not going to arrest them. So in some very real sense, all this debate about where could we best prosecute aggression and other types of crimes is kind of moot when we're talking about the most responsible suspects, because no matter what we choose, it's unlikely that they're ever going to get their hands on the defendants. Now, there's a related issue there, and I'll come back to your more specific question in a second. There's a related question there about whether you could try these people in absentia without actually having them in the dock, sitting in the court. There is a little bit of precedent for this in international law. The Special Tribunal for Lebanon held its only trial in absentia because they could never capture the Hezbollah suspects that they wanted to prosecute. Ukraine itself does have in absentia trials being a legal possibility. International law doesn't specifically say you can't do it, but it is extremely disfavored in international law. It is very hard to protect the defendant's rights when the defendant isn't there. And even if the defendant just doesn't want to show up, international law imposes a whole bunch of restrictions on how these trials can be held. It usually requires a completely new trial if you actually get your hands on the suspect that you have convicted in absentia. So it's probably not a particularly realistic choice for any tribunal, international or domestic. So we're talking about in person, and that means the getting your hands on the defendant issue is a really important one. Now, that's the more practical issue. There's also, and I think this might have been what you were hinting at, there's also a legal issue, which is we have in international law certain types of immunity. And one of the most important forms of immunity is what we call personal immunity, or immunity rationi personae, which says for a very, 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 very small group of government officials, while they're in power, they are absolutely immune from any kind of criminal prosecution in any domestic court. And so there is no doubt under international law that, say, Ukraine or Poland or Lithuania, that none of them could prosecute Putin as the head of state. None of them could prosecute Sergei Lavrov as the foreign minister, because they are both entitled to personal immunity. So right off the bat, probably the big fish are simply outside the bounds of a purely domestic prosecution. Now, if we had 6 hours, we could have a full discussion about these international tribunals can prosecute them. If you ask the tribunals themselves, they tend to say, oh, of course we can prosecute somebody even though they're a sitting head of state or a sitting foreign minister. I happen to think that's wrong. And I don't think any of the international or internationalized options that we were discussing before could take away Putin and Lavrov's personal immunity. And so I think even those tribunals are limited to those government officials in Russia who aren't entitled to personal immunity. The good news being, of course, that it's basically everybody else. Really at most, there's probably 3 government officials in Russia that are completely immune to prosecution. So it doesn't detract from the desirability of these other types of courts. It just means that I think if we're being honest with ourselves and we're trying to stay true to, I think, relatively settled international law, we are probably going to have to accept that it's unlikely, barring regime change in Russia, that Putin and Lavrov will ever end up in the dock.
Yeah. So this leads me to my next question. So this immunity can be, like we've seen like previously in Georgia, Crimea, Chechnya, Syria, like Russia didn't respect international law because also like its like leaders are protected by this immunity, and I've never been worried about it. So do you think, but I guess it's no, like why maybe it will be different now with Ukraine? And do you think like the international system is still like ruled by the might makes right, or because of this law of like the rule of like immunity, or lack of like responsibility of the leaders or not?
I mean, there are reasonable arguments both ways. I mean, it is frustrating when personal immunity could prevent somebody who has committed serious international crimes from being committed. And there's no question that that's one of its functions. It will prevent someone from being prosecuted who has committed serious international crimes. But that doesn't mean that like there's no basis or no rationale for personal immunity, that this was invented by a bunch of dictators to protect themselves. Far from it. The whole point of personal immunity is to say, even when 2 states are at war with each other, they need to be able to negotiate. They need to be able to talk to each other. They need to have diplomatic effort. And if you could arrest any, member of the enemy who has personal immunity, anytime you got near them, well, then states would never talk to each other. They would never send delegations to each other. Because I should say, as an aside, diplomats also have personal immunity. You can't arrest and prosecute a diplomat. So the point of personal immunity is to allow states to talk to each other, even in the middle of the worst, bloodiest, most unlawful wars. And so personal immunity doesn't just promote impunity. It also promotes diplomacy, and it promotes the negotiation of peace. So we always have to balance those 2 things against it. And we have to remind ourselves that although personal immunity is a very powerful barrier, governments fall, right? And, Omar al-Bashir had personal immunity while he was the president of Sudan. Once he was no longer the president of Sudan, well, then all bets are off. He could be prosecuted, and he may very well be by the ICC. Similarly, regimes can fall, and the immunity can just be, any immunity that they have could be waived. Unlikely in Russia. We're probably not going to see a regime change in Russia anytime soon. But personal immunity only exists as long as the person is in power. And so once they're no longer in power, as Bashir found out, as Charles Taylor found out, as others have found out, then all bets are off. So it might temporarily promote impunity, but that doesn't mean it's going to promote impunity for, forever.
Forever. Perfect. So I think you talked about it earlier. So you mentioned that at the national level in Ukraine, trials have already been started. We've seen it, I think, in April with Vadim Shishmarin, 21 years old, who was like the first Russian soldier that had been tried for war crimes. So as you mentioned, the Ukraine Prosecutor General in Ukraine, Irina Venediktova, sorry for the name, say that her office has started like 80 prosecution against Russian soldiers and identified 600 suspects. She's receiving reports of 200 to 300 war crimes every day. So my question is like, do you think the Ukrainian justice system can handle this amount of trial in terms of time, prison, finances? Do they have like the finances, political resource or not for doing so?
Well, I mean, not at those numbers. I mean, Ukraine has a very well-developed, very sophisticated criminal justice system. It has a decent number of well-trained prosecutors and judges and defense attorneys and investigators. And there's no question that they can handle a decent number of prosecutions. Whether they can handle hundreds or thousands of suspects involving tens of thousands of war crimes, probably not, which is why we want to encourage as many different types of accountability as we possibly can. Ukraine should prosecute people as long as they're doing it fairly, as much as they can. The ICC should prosecute individuals that it can get its hands on that have committed international crimes. We should create some kind of tribunal for to deal with aggression. We need a whole suite of accountability mechanisms, not just one, precisely because no individual court, whether international or domestic, can possibly handle all of the crimes and all of the suspects that have emerged out of the invasion of Ukraine.
Okay, perfect. So then my following question would be like, has we talk about like the crime of aggression, Russia violated the UN Charter, like the Article 2.4. So do you think there is a chance that Russia could be excluded from the UN, like what happened to the Soviet Union with the Society of Nations, or what could be if not? Because of course it's like at the head of like the Security Council and has the right of veto. But what could be the sanctions, or like the UN is powerless as always, as we could
the
see.
UN is powerless.
Yeah.
There's nothing that can be done to Russia in terms of the UN. It cannot be kicked out of the UN. It cannot have its permanent veto taken away. It can't be kicked off the Security Council. All of these things require a Security Council resolution.
Yeah.
And it could then veto any of these Security Council resolutions. And there's all this kind of, academic theorizing about clever ways to get around this, like, oh, well, maybe Article 27 says that Russia can't veto it's an action involving itself. All of this is just purely academic debate.
Yeah.
It is not going to happen. The Security Council would have to do it, and the Security Council can't do it because of Russia. So that's the reason why we see the sanctions regimes that are being imposed by states and by groups of states and by regional organizations, precisely because Russia doesn't have the same stranglehold over their action as it does over the UN's.
Yeah. But do you think then that maybe the international law should be rethink at like a regional scale, since it's not working at the international one? Or
what do you mean?
Regional, I don't know, but like in Europe, like we can see with the Council of Europe, I don't think they have like criminal like power to prosecute. I'm not sure of that. Like, stop me if I'm
no, but that's precisely why I think the Council of Europe should support Ukraine in developing its own kind of hybrid tribunal, because it can certainly support domestic efforts, but no, it can't necessarily create its own court.
Okay. Next question. Do you think Belarus has more chances of being convicted since they kind of like help Russia in this invasion, or like same, they are kind of like protected by the Russia, like, yeah.
I mean, I think it's probably in the same situation as Russia. I think Belarus is responsible for the crime of aggression, for allowing its territory to be used to stage attacks during and to launch the invasion. So I think there is criminal responsibility for the senior leadership for aggression, but again, getting your hands on the Belarusian officials like Lukashenko is probably not that much easier than getting your hands on a Putin. I suppose the chances of regime change in Belarus are a little bit higher than they would be in Russia. I mean, obviously there is a more active opposition, although Lukashenko has done a pretty good job of essentially destroying it through brute force. But I guess I would be less surprised to see Lukashenko tossed out of office at some point than I would Putin. And again, the minute that Lukashenko is no longer in power, well, then he would be subject to prosecution for aggression and other crimes. And who knows, maybe he would end up in the dock. He certainly is dependent on Russia for his survival, and is only good to them insofar as he's being helpful. So we could see things changing. But legally, there's not that much difference in his situation, say, than any of the Russians who are entitled to personal immunity.
Yeah, so they are helped by the Russia umbrella. Okay, so maybe let's look at the other side, like some Ukrainian soldiers have been accused of committing war crimes because they've been executing like Russian prisoner. The Ukrainian president said they will like be brought to justice, but some people are doubting of it. What do you think of like this like other side of the war that is not really shown, you know?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to comment on any of the specific situations or allegations, but it is important to understand that even in a war like the one that we're facing, one in which there is a clear aggressor like Russia, the fact that Russia is wrongfully invading Ukraine, the fact that Russia is committing crimes against Ukraine doesn't mean that Ukraine is free to commit international crimes. There is no two wrongs make a right in international law. So insofar as Ukrainians commit international crimes, well, they are subject to investigation and prosecution for them. And I have no doubt that they are fewer in number than Russia's, but any war crime is a serious matter and needs to be taken seriously. And we'll see how efforts at accountability play out. Of course, Ukraine has the right to prosecute its own soldiers for international crimes, as long as it does so genuinely and sincerely and really does try to bring them to justice. It has that right. But the ICC doesn't just investigate sides to a conflict, it investigates situations. So the ICC can investigate any crime committed on the territory of Ukraine, not just those that are committed by Russia.
Yeah. So, like the past UN reports shown that sexual violence are the most hidden crime being committed against Ukrainian in this conflict. The absence of rule of law, impunity, weakened state institutions, and above all, gender equality constitute one of the causes leading to such behavior. Former cases such as in Rwanda and in Yugoslavia have shown a lack of judgment containing a rape conviction and a high number of acquittal for rape. As a matter of fact, in Rwanda, there was like a double number of acquittal for rape than there were rape convictions. Considering those figures, do you think like fair justice for victims of conflict-related sexual violence promises to be unlikely as well in Ukraine?
I mean, it's impossible to answer that question. I'm sure that Ukraine's own criminal justice system will take sexual violence seriously. It is undeniable that when you have situations involving, allegations of systematic murder, that the allegations of sexual violence tend to take a back seat, at least initially, rightfully or wrongfully. I'm not saying that it should, but it often does. But by the same token, the ICC, I think, has become much more committed to prosecuting sexual and gender-based violence over the past, 5 or 10 years than initially. And Karim Khan has been very clear that his office is going to take allegations of sexual and gender-based violence really seriously. So insofar as there is evidence of those crimes being committed in Ukraine, I have absolutely no doubt that the Office of the Prosecutor will prioritize them and will want to send the message that this kind of violence during wartime is unacceptable, even if it's common.
But my question would be like, why do you think in Rwanda and ex-Yugoslavia trial, like those kinds of like crime haven't been like recognized? Was it like maybe by a lack of evidence or so? Even though
no, I don't think it's lack of evidence. I think it's a lack of prosecutorial will in those tribunals. There is no question that international law has not taken sexual and gender-based violence anywhere near seriously enough. And then that really didn't start to change kind of until the Rome Statute and the creation of the International Criminal Court. We've never taken particularly rape as seriously as it deserves. It wasn't even considered a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions when the Geneva Conventions were adopted. So there's no question that international law has not caught up to kind of current understandings and abhorrence of sexual violence. So hopefully that will get better in the future, but nothing will kind of erase the stain of the under prosecution of rape and other forms of sexual violence that we've seen over the past 30 years. All we can do is do better. We can't change what happened before.
Well, maybe let's see if there is change at least with this war.
I hope so. I think we can be at least reasonably optimistic that those types of violence will be taken more seriously in this situation.
So here comes my provocative question, or not really provocative, like you will decide it yourself. So in your article, you discussed the problem of selectivity in the international justice. So do you think international law is a fair law since there is no equity in its enforcement? Do you think that perhaps its application is a result of like a Western colonial legacy or like a utopia serving Western countries? Since like there is, for instance, like I think 5 years ago, like mostly like African countries are really like unhappy and decide to like withdraw from like the International Criminal Court. Like, what do you think about that?
I mean, again, there's too many questions all wrapped up in there.
Sorry.
Selectivity is always going to be a problem in international criminal law. There aren't enough courts, there aren't enough prosecutors, there aren't enough resources to ever prosecute any more than a very tiny fraction of the crimes committed in the world. That doesn't mean that every prosecution is itself victor's justice. That's not necessarily the case. And we are often prosecuting guilty people. And the fact that you prosecute someone who's guilty doesn't mean that, that it doesn't mean that the other people aren't guilty. And it doesn't invalidate their conviction to say that there are other people as equally guilty as the ones that are prosecuted. That said, we do always have to be aware of the effect selectivity has on perceptions of legitimacy. And when, think back to the early days of the International Criminal Court, when all of the investigations and prosecutions were in the continent of Africa. Again, that doesn't mean that the people that they were investigating weren't guilty. It doesn't mean that they weren't deserving of prosecution, but it was quite delegitimizing in the eyes, particularly of states in the global South, that looking around the world and seeing all kinds of international crimes being committed outside of Africa, the ICC was only focusing on the ones in Africa. That's pretty devastating to the court's legitimacy, and it's taken them a long time to start improving those perceptions. Now, in my own work on aggression, I have come out very strongly about not necessarily that it would be inherently selective to just prosecute Russian aggression against Ukraine, but that the way that you prosecute Russian aggression against Ukraine really does matter for the legitimacy of those prosecutions and really the legitimacy of the crime of aggression itself. And so what I've argued was that if we go the special tribunal route, and we have a small number of countries putting together a court to prosecute just Russian aggression, that if that court is going to be dominated and run by the same states that committed aggression against Iraq 20 years ago, or run and operated by the same states that were responsible for making the ICC's jurisdiction over aggression so incredibly narrow, that would not be seen as legitimate by most states. That would be seen as a bunch of powerful Western states prosecuting Russia because they can, and that they will never prosecute, of course, themselves for similar acts. So if there's going to be some kind of international or internationalized court, it needs to be either run by states that don't have unclean hands, like the US and the UK and Japan and Canada and Australia, or it really needs to be a court that has been overwhelmingly blessed by the United Nations General Assembly. The General Assembly, of course, representing all of the world states. My preference would be for the internationalized tribunal that would be, assisted by the Council of Europe, because the Council of Europe doesn't contain the United States. Most of the countries in the Council of Europe have ratified the Rome Statute. Most of the ratifications of aggression amendments are by states that are members of the Council of Europe. I think as a regional organization, it would have the legitimacy to engage in prosecutions of Russians, acknowledging that there are other acts of aggression around the world. Beyond that, I am not against a UN agreement with Ukraine to create a more of an ad hoc tribunal, but I am very skeptical that if you put it to a vote, that the United Nations General Assembly would overwhelmingly support that tribunal. I think it's very unlikely.
sorry, like what is the decision making? Do you need like the majority or like the unanimity? Like it depends also on that, like the what decision making process is going on, like to vote this,
Well,
like what.
I mean, basically what you would do is you would have an agreement between like probably the UN Secretary General and Ukraine to set up a tribunal, and then you would just ask the General Assembly to pass a resolution endorsing that tribunal. And maybe, I think if you're going to try to prosecute a Putin or Lavrov, that resolution would also have to say, oh, and by the way, there is no personal immunity for heads of state who are accused of committing international crimes. And if you had that kind of resolution that was passed by, I mean, there's no objective number, but like an overwhelming majority of states, I think we could craft an argument that that would make the tribunal legitimate and might be the kind of resolution that could very rapidly make international law and justify taking away personal immunity from heads of states who are accused of international crimes, in theory. But would an overwhelming majority of states support that resolution? I am extremely skeptical. And all we have to say is African Union. African Union consists of 55 states. The African Union is on record formally opposed to the idea that an international tribunal can take away personal immunity from heads of state. So the chances of more than 2 or 3 of those 55 states voting in favor of that resolution are essentially zero. So right there, and that's not even counting South American states or states in the Middle East that probably feel the same way. I could very easily see a resolution endorsing a tribunal and taking away personal immunity, not just not passing or not just passing by a very, very narrow majority, but actually failing. And I think a failed resolution, or even a resolution that passed, with maybe a bare majority, that I don't think that would be the kind of resolution that would allow a tribunal to enjoy legitimacy, much less actually take away personal immunity from a sitting head of state. So I don't think that avenue, even though it's more legally attractive, is is politically attractive.
It will be like a counter effect, kind of like snowball effect.
It would backfire. I think it would really backfire. So again, I come down on this on the side of, if you're going to have an ad hoc tribunal, make sure it is run and created and run by states that don't have dirty hands with the crime of aggression, or set up something like I endorse, this Ukraine-based special court that would be assisted by, say, the Council of Europe to prosecute aggression. I think either of those are better than any of the alternatives, even if they are somewhat, unlikely in the short term.
So this is my last question. So kind of like, what then needs to happen to reach accountability? Do you think there is like enough political and financial resources available to bring this accountability? And well, like, what would be the key reforms needed to make at least like a more like bit more efficient international law against like crimes like war crimes and so on?
I don't know if I can understand your second question.
You didn't understand the questions?
The second part of your question, I didn't
understand. The second, I was like going to say, what would be like the reform needed and possible to happen, of course, to like make the international law a bit more like efficient?
Oh yeah, easy question. No problem.
Easy.
So I mean, with the first part of the question, there's plenty of money in the international community to create a very effective court for prosecuting, say, aggression. One probably 5 years of a court's operating expenses would be less than one F-35 fighter plane. You're talking, states that spend billions, if not trillions of dollars on defense. They can certainly afford 150 or 200 million euros to try to bring accountability to Russia in terms of the crime of aggression. So if there's the will and they do it the right way, there's no reason why a court like that couldn't be created.
Do you think there is like a political will, like of bringing those?
I mean, again, what do you mean by political will? I mean, there are certainly plenty of wealthy countries other than the US and the UK and France and Germany, which are all kind of skeptical, I think, of this, or at least UK, France, and the US, very skeptical of this kind of tribunal. you know, the Norways and the Swedens and my own country that I'm sitting in right now, Denmark, you know, they have more than enough money to create a tribunal of this nature if they want to. So it's a question of will. It's not a question of resources. In terms of making international law run better, well, I've often advocated that every country in the world other than the P5 should immediately resign from the UN and create UN 2.0 that doesn't have a permanent veto, knowing that the P5 will never join it. I don't think that's probably going to happen. There's just no easy answer to that. You know, and I think probably, since this is the last question, you know, what people who are not international lawyers, and actually, frankly, people who are international lawyers, need to understand is that international law is not coming to save us. It is not the answer to the world's problems. It is not some magic wand that we can wave and make the reality of power and power politics go away. It's not that it can't do anything. It can do some things, but it doesn't do much, and it doesn't do much very well. And it doesn't do very much well because it's created by states, and states don't tend to create rules that bind themselves in ways that they don't want to be bound. So it's not meaningless by any stretch of the imagination, but it is not a panacea. It is not a cure for what ails the world, or, you know, what ails the world. So we should develop international law. We should push international law. We should try to use it strategically any way we can. And Ukraine has been really brilliant in pursuing its legal strategies, a whole bunch of different forums. But ultimately, if we're going to radically reshape the international order and change the world and bring peace, it's not going to be through international law and international institutions. It is going to be through individuals and groups engaged in political struggle, pretty much like it always has been. You know,
impacting
so
maybe national structure, no? Sorry. Maybe like individuals or like groups, maybe like impacting national structure.
Absolutely. And international ones for that matter. I mean, you know, the power of mass politics is still pretty great. Again, also not a magic wand, you know, but I think political struggle is far more likely to lead to progressive outcomes than legal struggle. And so we shouldn't abandon legal struggle, but we should understand its limitations and always put it in context and not allow it to be the first, second, third, and last response to atrocity, because it's not going to solve atrocity by itself. And people who think otherwise are just going to be disappointed by international law, and eventually they're going to turn against international law. And so the more that we international lawyers oversell what we can do, the worse international law is in the long run. And so modesty is a very important quality when one is an international lawyer.
And to not sell fake like hopes that won't happen to everyone with like utopia. Okay, perfect. I think I'm done. Unless you want to add something else.
No, that was pretty comprehensive.
So I just have to say thank you so much for your expertise and your clear answer and your knowledge that you brought to like enlighten us on this tricky issue. Really tricky, actually. And I hope we will have a next talk together to talk about that.
Likewise.
Something else, whatever. Yeah. Thank you.